paper with you all. I'm so excited to share it with you, but because seeing me on the screen read the paper is not really going to help you comprehend the material, I am going to consult my handy dandy PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my screen with you and I'm going to get into the PowerPoint. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. Fake news in the information age, the challenges it poses for peace. One of the sharpest splinters in our effort to foster peace and hope in these dark times is the phenomenon known as truth decay. After the polarizing 2020 presidential election between the incumbent Republican Donald Trump and his Democratic challenger, former Vice President Joe Biden, Trump's predecessor, President Barack Obama, gave an interview to CBS's Scott Pelley on the television program 60 Minutes to promote his new memoir, A Promised Land. In this interview, President Obama defined truth decay as, quote, the sense that not only do we not have to tell the truth, but the truth doesn't even matter, end of quote. Truth decay is an unfortunate symptom of the mass spread of misinformation through social media outlets and other mediums of communication known as fake news. The Associated Press defines fake news as, quote, deliberately false stories that appear to come from credible journalistic sources, designed to be spread around the internet, previously as jokes, but increasingly often to influence political opinion. This poses significant challenges for peace as it is defined by UNESCO's former Director General Irina Bokova. Quote, peace is more than the absence of war. It is living together with our differences of sex, race, language, religion, or culture, while furthering universal respect for justice and human rights on which such coexistence depends. There are two ethical commitments that we must make if we accept Bokova's definition of peace. First commitment is a tolerance for differences in sex, race, language, religion, and culture. The second commitment is a universal respect for justice and human rights. The former requires us to be open minded and receptive to those who are different from us through social engagement. The latter requires us to be committed to the universal truths of justice and human rights. In this essay, I will demonstrate how fake news hinders our ability to uphold these ethical commitments and propose a solution to this dilemma. First, I will argue that the public panic over fake news has led people to seal themselves in information echo chambers that shuts them off from social engagement with others who are different from them, and demonstrate how this has led to social discord. Second, I will impress upon the importance of teaching citizens the proper critical thinking skills that would enable them to thoughtfully engage with the mass amount of information and discern real news from the fake news that hinders their ability to uphold the universal truths of justice and human rights. Third, I will argue that an educated citizenry is vital to restoring the currently eroding public trust in mainstream media sources and illustrate why this is critical for the preservation of democratic institutions and social harmony. Fake news has become a main staple of the social media diets consumed on a daily basis. The 2019 Ipsos survey found that 86% of online global citizens were exposed to fake news. There are three reasons why this is particularly concerning for the United States. First, 79% of Americans today use some form of social media. Second, false information spreads faster than true information on social media platforms. And third, since social media algorithms are based on user engagement, the information presented to users on social media platforms is more likely to reinforce their current political opinions and cause intense emotional reactions of happiness, sadness, or anger, instead of presenting them with a full and complete picture of reality. The American citizenry is not completely oblivious to the political and social problems that fake news presents. In fact, a majority of them believe that fake news is causing significant harm to the country and needs to be stopped. However, the public panic over fake news combined with the high emotional temperature of the country has driven citizens to drop some news outlets, consume less information overall, and end social relationships with those they disagree with. In his acceptance speech at the 1996 Republican National Convention, the Republican presidential nominee, Senator Bob Dole, said, quote, he, referring to his Democratic opponent, President Bill Clinton, is my opponent, not my enemy. At that time, the median Democrat and the median Republican were much more ideologically aligned in the center than they are now. Americans started using social media in 2005, though at that time it was only a meager 5% of the population. As more people gained access to technology, more people started using social media through the years, and Democrats and Republicans have since become much more ideologically polarized. While there is not a direct causal link between more people using social media and increasing ideological polarization, there is a clear correlation. In 2014, 62% of Americans used some form of social media, and Democrats and Republicans were more ideologically polarized that year than they had been in the previous 2 decades. In 2020, that polarization accelerated to a new level, far surpassing that of 2014. Pew Research Center reported that Joe Biden supporters and Donald Trump supporters believe they fundamentally disagree with each other, not just on political priorities, but also on core American values. 90% of Biden supporters and 89% of Trump supporters said that lasting harm would be inflicted on the country if the other candidate won the election. The day after the election, David French of Time magazine wrote, quote, "The presidency may change hands, but the fundamental reality of American politics and culture remain the same. Our nation is deeply divided, our partisans are very angry, and there is no immediate prospect for change," end of quote. French's claim was confirmed in a new academic survey which found that 69% of Trump's voters lacked confidence in the fairness of the election compared to 8% of Biden's voters. This lack of confidence in the fairness of the election persists among Trump's voters, despite the fact that the federal cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency stated, quote, "The November 3rd election was the most secure in American history. There is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised," end of quote. This points to an unfortunate conclusion. The mass spread of fake news, particularly on social media platforms, has accelerated political polarization in the United States and led the country to a dangerous state of social discord. The core component of this social discord is the failure of the population to agree on a set of facts that are held to be universally true. This is a problem for peace because the second ethical commitment of peace requires that we uphold the universal truths of justice and human rights. Hallie Sherritt, an associate professor of cognitive neuroscience at University College London, performed a set of studies on this issue and reached the following conclusion. Quote, "In order to assess data and decide what is true, the brain relies heavily on its emotional system. It is important to be acutely aware that it is people's feelings, hopes, and fears that play a central role in whether a piece of evidence will influence their beliefs. The fact that our brain relies heavily on its emotional system when evaluating information is one of the main reasons why political partisans disagree on what qualifies as real news and what qualifies as fake news. When we evaluate information, we always do so from a certain perspective. This presents a problem for those who want to access a set of objective facts that correspond to reality as it really is. Does such a thing as value-free facts untainted by the stain of personal bias exist? To answer this question, I will consult the work of the existentialist philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. In his essay, The Primacy of Perception and Its Philosophical Quinces, Merleau-Ponty wrote that the foundational starting point for all epistemic inquiry is the perceived world. Quote, "The perceived world is the always presupposed foundation of all rationality, all value, and all existence. This thesis does not destroy either rationality or the absolute. It only tries to bring them down to earth," end of quote. If we are seeking to know whether or not value-free facts exist and the perceived world is the foundation for all epistemic inquiry, we must know what perception is, and we must also know what the structure of the perceived world is like. Our experience of perception, Merleau-Ponty tells us, quote, "is our presence at the moment when things, truths, and values are constituted for us," end of quote. In the essay and unpublished text by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a prospectus of his work, he describes the structure of the perceived world in the following way. Quote, "We find that perceived things, unlike geometrical objects, are not bounded entities whose laws we possess a priori, but they are open, inexhaustible systems which we recognize through a certain style of development. Although we are never able in principle to explore them entirely, and even though they never give us more than profiles and perspectival views of themselves. Finally, we find that the perceived world in its turn is not a pure object of thought without fissures or lacunae. It is rather like a universal style shared in by all perceptual beings, end of quote. Now, what does all of this mean for our notion of facts? It is tempting to echo Friedrich Nietzsche here and say that there are no facts, only interpretations. However, this is not what Merleau-Ponty wants us to do. As stated previously, he does not want to destroy rationality or the absolute. He just wants to bring them down to earth. The reason why he wants to bring them down to earth is because there can be no notion of rationality or the absolute separate from perceptual experience. If this is true, is there such a thing as objectivity? Merleau-Ponty believes so, but he does not define objectivity in the same manner as those who believe in a correspondence theory of truth. Instead, he defines objectivity as intersubjective being. Quote, it is thus necessary that in the perception of another, I find myself in relation with another myself, who is in principle open to the same truths as I am, in relation to the same being that I am. And this perception is realized. From the depths of my subjectivity, I see another subjectivity invested with equal rights appear because the behavior of the other takes place within my perceptual field and confers on my objects the new dimension of intersubjective being, or in other words, of objectivity, end of quote. There are a couple of points that I would like to draw attention to here. First, since things in the perceived world never give us more than profiles and perspectival views of themselves during our perceptual experience of them, the facts that we can know about them never fully exhaust their being. Second, if perception is understood as our presence when things, truths, and values are constituted for us, then there is an overlap between truths and values in perceptual experience. Third, if objectivity is understood to be intersubjectivity, and intersubjectivity requires that the other person be open-minded to the same truths as I am, then the other person must necessarily be open-minded. What this means is that not only do value-free facts not exist, but facts are always value-laden. This is why Sherritt's studies show that the brain relies heavily on its emotional system when evaluating information. Since facts are always perceived from a value-laden perspective, how do we discern between real news and fake news? A study by MIT's Sloan School of Management found that political bias is actually not the main reason why people are so susceptible to fake news. Instead, it is the practice of cognitive laziness, also known as lazy thinking. The study also found that those who engage in more analytical thinking are better at discerning true from false, regardless of identified motivations or political biases. Another study by this institution found that when people were able to deliberate about the accuracies and inaccuracies of news stories instead of giving snap judgments, they were more likely to identify which stories were true and which stories were false. If people are more likely to identify which news stories are true and which news stories are false when they have a chance to deliberate about them, then it seems that deliberation is how we can discern between real news and fake news. According to Aristotle, the excellent deliberator begins with a rational wish guided by an understanding of happiness. If the deliberator wants to discern between real news and fake news, they must have the rational wish to find the truth. The wish to find the truth must be guided by an understanding of happiness because this is what equips the person with the necessary critical thinking tools required for deliberation. According to Plato's virtue-based theory of ethics, happiness or well-being is the highest aim of moral thought and conduct, and the virtues are the requisite skills and dispositions needed to attain it. This means that the virtues are the necessary critical thinking tools required for deliberation. But this is a puzzling claim. Why would the virtues be the necessary critical thinking tools required for deliberation? Virtue is defined as, quote, the utmost of what a person can be, and is traditionally associated with ethics. However, many philosophers, including Plato, John Locke, and Thomas Jefferson, believed that the primary goal of education should be to aid in the formation of a person's moral character by teaching them how to cultivate virtue. And more recent philosophical literature has explored the relationship between virtue and epistemology. The virtues that are associated with epistemology are known as the intellectual virtues. There are two prevailing views about the nature of intellectual virtues. The first view is virtue reliabilism, and the second view is virtue responsibilism. Virtue reliabilism holds that the intellectual virtues are natural abilities like sense perception, memory, induction, and deduction. Virtue responsibilism holds that the intellectual virtues are acquired character traits like conscientiousness, open-mindedness, and intellectual courage. In her article, Teaching Intellectual Virtues, Applying Virtue Epistemology in the Classroom, Heather Batali suggests that both of these categories of intellectual virtues can be taught in an academic setting through a combination of imitation and practice on the part of the student and lecture and explanation on the part of the instructor. She gives a broad recommendation for how the reliabilist virtues can be taught and several examples for how the responsibilist virtues can be taught. To teach the reliabilist virtues, Batali recommends that instructors utilize classroom activities that involve students exercising deductive and inductive reasoning, as well as cultivating the necessary skills that are required for identifying, evaluating, and constructing arguments. Her list of examples for teaching the responsibilist virtues is much more extensive, but they are all unified by the goal of helping students cultivate a love for the truth. In her first example, she says that students can analyze an ethical dilemma from a hypothetical thought experiment, a work of literature, or a real-world event, and then answer a set of questions like the following three. Number one, what different intellectual actions might person A perform? Number two, what were person A's motivations? And number three, what intellectual actions do you think a virtuous person would perform in this situation and why? Second, she says that classroom discussions, argumentative papers, and oral presentations can be adapted for the purpose of getting students to practice intellectually virtuous actions and motivations. These activities provide students with opportunities to defend their views against objections, listen to views that contradict their own, and reform their own views. All of these intellectual virtues are the necessary critical thinking tools required for deliberation. If we are to uphold the universal truths of justice and human rights, we must believe them to be values worth upholding and use them in our interpretation of data. Educating citizens in the intellectual virtues is important not only for the purpose of teaching them how to discern between real news and fake news, but also for restoring their trust in one of the most critical institutions of our democratic society, the free and independent press. As democratic citizens, we depend on a free and independent press to give us accurate information about current events. However, the public's current level of trust in the press is very mediocre at best. A Gallup poll found that only 4 in 10 Americans have a fair amount of trust in the press compared to the 6 in 10 who do not. The primary reason why people have a relatively low level of trust in the press is because they perceive a certain level of bias in the press's coverage of news stories. Since I previously established that facts will always be presented from a value-laden perspective, we must chart a different path forward if we want to repair the public's trust in the press. First, by understanding the perceived world as the foundation for all epistemic inquiry, we must understand that news outlets will never give us a full and complete picture of reality, and frankly, we should not expect them to. Such a thing is impossible. We should always expect a news outlet to present a story to us from a certain perspective. Second, we must use the intellectual virtues to evaluate the epistemic credibility of the news outlet and the information it presents to us. This can be done through the exercise of Aristotelian deliberation. If we love the truth, we will actively seek out information about current events. If we thoughtfully engage in deliberation with the aid of the intellectual virtues, we will be able to discern between real news and fake news. Just because the press presents news stories to us from a value-laden perspective does not mean that we should completely abandon them. Instead, we should acknowledge and accept what the press really is. It is not a group of completely neutral arbiters of truth. Rather, it consists of a group of perceiving subjects who interpret the world from a certain perspective. In discerning whether or not what they say is true, we should consider their motives and intellectual virtues. If we share those same motives and intellectual virtues, we will likely come to the conclusion that what they say is true. It is vital for the survival of democratic institutions that we embrace this framework and begin to repair the relationship between the public and the press. If we are to restore some sense of social harmony, we must move toward establishing a set of basic facts that the whole population can agree to. The social discord caused by the mass spread of fake news has been a sharp splinter in our effort to foster peace and hope in these dark times. But the good news is that there is a very clear solution to address it and promote the cause of peace and hope. Since cognitive laziness is the primary reason why people cannot discern between real news and fake news, we must educate them in the necessary intellectual virtues that will enable them to engage in deliberation and other forms of analytical thinking. This starts with acknowledging that facts are value-laden and necessarily so, but this does not mean that they are of no critical importance to democratic institutions and to the two ethical commitments required for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Dakota. Okay, let me see here in the chat. We have several questions. Let me see. I think I saw Pierce, you're up first.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation, Dakota. It hits on a really big strand of what I've been interested in for the last few months. I guess one of the issues that I've had in similar research and what I think you're going to face as well is that an educational apparatus to help fix inquirers to be able to turn away from fake news takes a lot of time. It's, we have to re-educate the population, or not re-educate, that's a poor term, properly educate the population to be able to inquire in a different way. And because of that, it means that generationally, the problem has to be solved instead of with the current population. And so the issue with that is that you have increasing instability over time. So my question was, what have you thought about with more close-in, near solutions, possibly from, I know you kind of lend yourself to continental issues, so have you explored like deliberative democracy coming out of Habermas at all? That was immediately what popped in my head, him and Talisa's new book.
Thank you, Pierce, for your question. I'm happy that you enjoyed the paper. I know of Habermas, but I have not read any of his work. As far as to your question on what we can do in the short term, it's very difficult to say because, as you highlighted, the problem is not short term, it is long term. As a matter of fact, the very reason why people are so susceptible to fake news is because we have created a generation of people who do not have the proper tools that would enable them to deliberate on what is real news and what is fake news. So because that is such a big problem, we have to take the long road and re-educate a new generation of people to really combat this problem. But here is what I would say is in the near term. First of all, because there is in my mind, a very clear solution to the problem, we shouldn't lose hope. I mean, I understand with the riots at the Capitol building, it feels like maybe there is no hope to the problem and this is going to be with us for a while. And it is going to be with us for a while. But we have to keep hope. Second of all, I encourage everyone, tell the truth and share the truth and understand that the truth is something that's worth fighting for. Because a lot of people believe that social discord and fake news is something worth fighting for. We also should want to fight for truth. And third of all, I would say that I think that social media companies need to do a much better job of moderating their platforms to where disinformation cannot be so easily disseminated. I've contemplated the possibility, and before I say it, that what the possibility is, I've since distanced myself from it. But I've wondered whether or not the solution to the problem is like an Orwellian ministry of truth. And I've come to the conclusion that the main problem is that people don't have a high level of confidence in mainstream media. So if the ministry of truth is created, that will only exacerbate the problem. It will do nothing to raise people's confidence. What we have to do is we have to educate these people, because that's going to be the only way to restore their confidence in mainstream media. I hope that answered your question. I know it's a really difficult issue, but it really is a long-term problem that merits a long-term solution.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let Garrett ask one more question for this session. What I'd like to do, maybe at the end of the session, if there are several questions for Dakota that we're not going to get to keep relatively on time, but at the end of the session, if people want to continue to chat, since we're going into the lunch break, we can do that. So Garrett?
Hi, Dakota. Thank you for the paper. It's very interesting, obviously timely and important. I want to complicate, I think, your solution a little bit, because I think that the problem is probably a little more complicated than you realize. Starting with the fake news component, as you define fake news, it's deliberately misleading stories that are manufactured either for the lulz or to push a political agenda. But there's a more insidious problem than fake news thusly defined, and that's simply news that is biased or one-sided or slanted. An awful lot of media coverage isn't deliberately trying to misinform or mislead people or even just push an agenda. It's simply coming from organizations and individuals that have a particular perspective on the world, and they filter objective facts through those values as you outlined. And the sets of values through which they are presenting the world might be incompatible with the sorts of values that people like perhaps like you and I are viewing it. So if we have not just bad actors out there who are trying to undermine the truth, which again we can all agree is terrible, but if we have instead a bunch of good faith actors who are simply operating from radically different sets of values about how to interpret the facts in the world, then it might be a lot harder to come to any kind of consensus. And I think this is one last little addendum here. This can be underscored by the fact that you say education is the solution, but right now there's more educated people on the planet than ever before in human history. And that's both in terms of absolute number and in terms of percentage. But the problem seems to be getting much worse rather than better. If we're simple as educating people, you would think that we would be solving the problem as people get more educated. But instead, I think what you're seeing is that education actually inspires people to share different kinds of values that they then bring to bear on these objective facts. So if I can put it in a more direct question to you, given the possibility of good faith disagreement that goes very, very deep, is it as simple as educating people out of this problem?
Thank you, Garrett, for your question. That's something I thought about as I was writing the paper, and I've wondered a lot about. And from what my current thoughts are, I can tell you what my two thoughts on it. First of all, it is true that the press, whatever outlet it is going to be presenting information to us from a certain perspective. When I read the New York Times, I'm going to expect a slightly left of center perspective. And likewise, when I read the Wall Street Journal, I'm going to expect a right of center perspective. We should always expect that. And the task for us as critical thinkers is, to use Hillary Putnam's expression, the pragmatist philosopher, is we're trying to weave together a picture from what all of these outlets are reporting to us. And something about that and why I'm advocating for educating people in the intellectual virtues is the intellectual virtues, while they are virtues and they are certain values, they're inherently pluralistic. They're not tied to a certain view of the world necessarily. I think a love for truth, intellectual open-mindedness, intellectual courage, intellectual humility, and even inductive and deductive reasoning are things that are not confined to a particular view of the world. But second of all, you talked about how we have a lot of educated people out there. The question is not necessarily whether or not they're just educated, but what is their level of education? And what are these people studying, right? And so we need to really revisit how we are designing curriculums, and are we actually teaching students to critically think? I mean, this is something that's been going on for a while now in public education. But I would say this, we need to encourage people to pursue higher levels of education, like graduate degrees. And we also need to realize that we're not just giving these people tools to go and get jobs and make money. We're giving these people education so they can be good citizens. And until that happens, our democracy is going to be lacking a very vital component, which, as Jefferson and the founding fathers knew, was a virtuously educated citizenry. I hope that's answered your question.
Thanks,
It
Dakota.
addresses it, not answers it.
Thanks, Garrett and Dakota. We need to move on. Our next speaker is Danielle Poe. Sorry about that. Her topic is Behind the Curtain. Danielle, welcome. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go ahead and read my paper. I'm not as organized as Dakota in preparing a PowerPoint. It is such a pleasure to join you from Dayton, Ohio, and to see so many friends from over the years and new faces as well. So something I've become acutely aware of over the past couple of years is the strong correlation between privilege and injustice. That is to say, the more deeply I come to understand my privilege, the more deeply I also come to understand that my privilege comes at the expense of someone else. Certainly, some of my understanding of privilege and its impact on structures of justice and injustice has been evident since I first began to study feminism. But I was much more familiar with the disparities and structural injustices taking place between men and women than other kinds of disparities. Through teaching, researching, and writing, I had also become very aware of the ways in which white privilege impacts people of color, and that within US society, that disparity is particularly stark between white people and Black people. I even understood intersectionality as a theoretical concept. That is, I understood that if gender bias exists and racial bias exists, the two together are going to result in a multiplied experience of bias. But what I failed to really understand until this last year is that I need to do better to understand my white privilege as a white woman and the ways in which my privilege comes at the expense of women of color. And I need to act on this knowledge to disrupt that privilege and to become an ally in the struggle for justice. My journey toward understanding began with a call for papers from my concerned Philosophers for Peace colleague, Court Lewis. He and Gregory Bach were editing a volume on the ethics of anger and looking for contributions. Intrigued, I proposed writing a piece on feminism and anger, which was accepted for the volume. After initial research, I realized that feminists have been incredibly articulate about the ways in which anger has strengthened their resolve and fueled them to fight for justice. But in my research, I was also struck by another genre of feminist writing about anger. Feminists of color writing to and about white feminists. From that research, I realized that if I were to write a piece about finding my anger and harnessing that anger to be a better feminist, I would be hiding from the crucial work of acknowledging that I'm the cause of very just anger. And if I'm really going to continue to call myself a philosopher of peace, then I needed to write a different article, an article about the ways in which white women have been at odds with women of color and how we can do better to open space for women of color to express their anger, for us to listen to that anger, and to make changes to support equity and justice. So this paper continues to delve into the privilege that I occupy, the structural injustice of that privilege, and ways to start to deconstruct it. While my previous work looked more broadly at the relationship between white women and women of color, this paper will focus on white women and Black women. I chose this more narrow focus for reasons that Jennifer L. Ebhart describes in Biased. Quote, I talk a lot about race, specifically about Blacks and whites, because those two groups have been studied the most by researchers investigating bias. And because the racial dynamics between Blacks and whites are dramatic, consequential, and enduring, end quote. While all of the racial divides are important to consider and to undo, the history of bias between Black women and white women is so pervasive that it provides groundwork for us to uncover many of the ways in which we're shaped by bias and prejudice. By training ourselves to recognize bias and privilege, we create habits to recognize and change them in other areas as well. The bias of white women has become a tension between them and Black women throughout US history and is described by bell hooks in Teaching to Transgress. Quote, Black slave women harbored understandable resentment and repressed rage about racial oppression. but they were particularly aggrieved by the overwhelming absence of sympathy shown by white women in circumstances involving sexual and physical abuse of Black women, as well as situations where Black children were taken away from their enslaved mothers. Again, it was within this shared concern, white women knew the horror of sexual and physical abuse, as well as the depth of a mother's attachment to her children, that the majority of white women who might have experienced empathetic identification turned their backs on Black women's pain. Hooks emphasizes the failure of white women to have empathy for Black women, who, like them, have been abused and victimized, who also love their children and would do anything to save them. Instead, white women chose an allegiance to white men, whether they were husbands, brothers, or sons. They chose complicity with the grave harms and violence that comes with enslaving other people. This failure to build alliances with other women did not end when slavery ended. White women continued throughout the feminist and women's rights movements to, quote, protect their fragile social positions and power within patriarchal culture by asserting their superiority over Black women, end quote. Whether it was trying to prevent Sojourner Truth from speaking at a convention for women's rights in 1852, or using woman as synonymous with white women, white feminists have spent far too much of their attention and time defining ourselves and our liberation in comparison to white men, and doing so cultivates animosity between feminists. Hooks' powerful writing calls women to come together in new ways, forming bonds between women. To form these bonds, though, we have to struggle long and hard because our current divisiveness traces back to slavery and inscribing racial difference as the difference that keeps white women closer to the power that white men have. These beliefs were inscribed by enslaving people, Jim Crow laws, segregated cities, popular culture, political grandstanding, and day-to-day interactions. In order to reach the sisterhood that Hooks calls for, white women have to uncover the ways in which we impose our experiences as the norm. We fail to recognize the different impacts of oppression, and we center our discomfort or fear and displace the voices of Black women who can point out our racism, classism, and sexism. White women's resistance to hearing the truth about the impact of our actions can be addressed in part by focusing on the results of hearing this truth. White women are not called to do this work to provoke shame or guilt, but rather to incite change and the possibility of a new future. Audre Lorde explains this distinction in her classic speech to the National Women's Studies Association in 1981. Quote, "Every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. And when I speak of change, I do not mean a simple switch of positions or temporary lessening of tensions, nor the ability to smile and feel good. I am speaking of a basic and radical alteration to all those assumptions underlining our lives," end quote. Lorde's call to her audience, to women of many racial backgrounds, is to use their anger as energy and to accept that change calls for repeated effort if the change is going to last instead of being temporary and shallow. This is a call taken up by Brittany C. Cooper in her book, Eloquent Rage, written in 2018. Cooper invites her Black feminist colleagues to use their rage to bring about a new world. She writes, "The clarity that comes from rage should also tell us what kind of world we want to see, not just what kind of things we want to get rid of." The process of grappling with our history, uncovering bias, rejecting oppressive systems, expressing rage and anger, and accepting that rage and anger can finally bring us to a place where a new world can be imagined and brought to life. A new world not a world in which we aspire to become white men, but a genuinely new world. The need for a new world and new ways of thinking is made evident by many of the Black feminist philosophers writing today. And reading their work is inspiring me to rethink my feminism and my commitment to peace. Because as Denise James reminds us, philosophy done from a Black feminist standpoint can help to define, clarify, assess, and suggest changes in our social world that would greatly improve the lives of all people, end quote. Black feminism is much more than a reaction to racism. It is a vision for a new, more just future. We are challenged by James and by Cooper to look beyond the work of critiquing and undoing racist and sexist structures, because beyond that work, Black feminists are creating a new society, a more just society. But before we step into this hopeful and joy-filled future, we have the hard work of facing our history, one in which Black women have been marginalized, silenced, and labeled. In the halls of academia, we have shut out the voices of angry Black women in favor of so-called objective theory. The most revered philosophy journals insist on language and theories that are supposedly universal and use third person as a supposedly objective perspective. But to create a new world and to find justice, we need to listen to the theory that is personal and arises from individual experience. For example, Rachel Alicia Griffin is powerful in her article, "I Am an Angry Black Woman, Black Feminist Autoethnography, Voice, and Resistance." She writes, "Countless times in my life, I've been asked from someone using an exasperated tone, 'Rachel, why are you so angry?' As if the expression of my anger should come with a warning sign, an apology, and a cleanup crew. On most occasions, my response is to pose questions back by saying, 'Look into the world. How can I not be angry? How can you not be angry?' On a day when sass spills off the tip of my tongue, I might add, 'How can the whole damn world not be angry?'" End quote. Griffin's anger is rational and powerful. Her act of claiming of her anger is important because it demands that we pay attention to the countless reasons for her anger. One reason for this anger is the structural injustice that systematically excludes Black women from academia. Denise James puts the number of Black feminist philosophers at around 5. Brittany Cooper puts the number of Black feminist academics at about 10. And whether those differences in numbers are because of change in numbers or different definitions of who they're counting, the number can be counted on 2 hands. That representation carries burdens that white women don't have in academia. We have other white women who share the work of mentoring, committee membership, speaking out about our perspective. All of that falls disproportionately on Black women who are frequently the only Black woman in their department, division, or even university. Our Black colleagues also shoulder the burden of teaching students who have been immersed in the biased portrayal of Black women. So these students show less respect and are more harsh in their evaluation of teaching than when they take classes from white women. The work of understanding white privilege also means that white women need to check our implicit racist biases. Do we stop listening or become defensive when we hear critical comments from Black women? Do we dismiss them as too angry? Do we defend ourselves by insisting that we're allies or that we couldn't be biased because we're subject to sexism or teach about racism? I'll confess, I am not good with conflict. I do not want to be the object or cause of anger or pain for other people. So I catch myself self-coddling as I read articles, books, and blogs from Black feminists. My mind races to find counterexamples in which I've engaged in inclusive behavior or fought for someone who's been treated unjustly. I have to stop myself and to push myself out of the center of the narrative and re-engage in a way that centers someone else's experience. I'm lucky enough to have a colleague, Denise James, who I've quoted earlier, whose work and presence inspires me to listen carefully to the critiques, but also to the possibility of meaningful change. James, in an article entitled Playing the Race Game, uses her experience of educating students at our predominantly white Midwest university about race to illustrate the persistence of racism and white privilege. Her work to educate white students for social justice has 3 critical components. 1, help them find and understand injustice that they had failed to notice because of their privilege. Walk them through the thinking, choices, and beliefs that caused the injustice, and inspire them to act by emphasizing that if choices led us here, new choices create new possibilities. The classroom experience that she creates for students has a transformative process that Ebhart also describes in her social psychology research. That is, implicit bias may not be that easy to recognize and fight, but it can be addressed. And as it turns out, believing that it can be addressed is a critical ingredient to progress. I want to skip some things. Quote from Cooper. What would it mean to start from the fears of the marginalized and build a world that is safe for them? When we start from a Black feminist fears, we should expect anger, because those things that cause the fear are not inevitable and they are not just. One fear for Black feminists is that universities and colleges are structured to privilege white academics. And within that structure, they will struggle to find time for research since they're frequently overburdened with service. Once they find time to write, it's more difficult for them to publish their research if universities have expectations to publish in so-called top-tier journals. To address these fears, white feminists need to educate ourselves. This paper highlights just a fraction of the work available from Black feminists about their insights, experiences, and visions for the future. All of us can start our own education through blogs, podcasts, articles, books. We don't need to take more emotional time and energy from our colleagues, asking them to tell us their stories. We need to think about our own spheres of influence and how to use them. If you're a student, go out of your way to take classes from Black feminist faculty and from other marginalized feminists. Go into those classes hoping to hear eloquent rage. Educate yourself on your implicit bias so you can write honest evaluations of teaching, and recognize that the best teachers can make us personally uncomfortable. If you're faculty, go out of your way to listen and advocate for the ideas that come from your marginalized colleagues. When you hear their ideas being repeated and recognized by someone else in the group, speak up and remind the group who originated the idea. And I have a number of other suggestions for faculty. If you are in administration, one of your greatest opportunities is responsiveness. As with the list of action items for faculty, this may seem obvious, but simply being responsive builds trust and is far less easy than it seems when you're facing an avalanche of emails and tasks that impact your whole department, unit, or university. Nevertheless, a prompt response to an email builds trust, which leads to opportunities to collaborate widely and to elevate the work of those who are marginalized. The work that I'm calling for in this paper is not easy. I'm asking fellow white feminists to seek out and respond to the legitimate anger of Black feminists. We've failed them, and we need to hear the sorrow, pain, and rage we have caused. We need to take responsibility for those failures by working to correct them. In order to do this work, I'm going to leave you with the benediction from Cooper's book, Eloquent Rage, because Cooper leaves us with the vision of joy that waits for us on the other side of the anger. quote, "Joy, as I have heard countless Black preachers say, is different from happiness because happiness is predicated on happenings, on what's occurring, on whether your life is going right and whether all is well. Joy arises from an internal clarity about our purpose. My purpose is justice, and the fight for justice brings me joy." Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. We have a question from Barry Gann up first.
Hi, Paula. Perhaps an indelicate question, Danielle.
Sure.
How does the perspective of Black feminists differ from standing behind Rawls's veil of ignorance?
Well, so for me, that would be, so Rawls is really that objective, calling for that objective perspective behind the veil of ignorance. So you can imagine yourself as a Black woman in American society. And so that for him could be a very powerful way to adjust our system. So rather though than me imagining myself in that, I think to get to that point, we have to really immerse ourselves in the autobiographies, in the places where Black feminists are talking about their experiences and what they're going through. And I think we have a long way to go to decenter our experiences enough to get to that place where we could really enact that veil of ignorance. So I think they're related to each other. Sorry, I'm thinking this through as I talk. Is that helpful, Barry?
Yeah, there's a subjective element that is lacking in Rawls, and you're urging that we immerse ourselves in that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question up, Garrett.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you for the paper. I'm very sympathetic to your project. And so I suppose my question here is more, I guess, practical advice, because it seems like you've been working on this in a little more depth than I have. I've been trying to incorporate more Black feminist work into my pedagogy and to find ways in which it intersects with the topics that I can speak knowledgeably on. But one of the difficulties that I encounter in doing this is the rather obvious fact that, as I come to speak to my students to try to explain to them the scholarship and the literature as I understand it and how it pertains to the larger themes and problems of the class, the obvious and relevant fact of my white maleness can, in some cases, be an obstacle to my students hearing me in any way as of an authority or something like that can speak knowledgeably about this. I am concerned, and some students have expressed this to me, that it's pretty easy to dismiss my encouragement that they listen to these Black voices and to these women's voices simply in virtue of the fact that their experience is so alien from mine. In a strange respect, they would actually possibly take me more seriously if I were a Black woman trying to teach them this stuff than being a white man. So in your experiences, obviously as a white woman, not as a white man, do you have any techniques or any ways in which you can help sort of be more of an ambassador in that way between non-Black, non-women and yourself as a white woman, to try to sort of show that you don't have to be a Black woman to take the concerns of Black women seriously, or to understand, to a certain extent at least, the struggles that they're dealing with, and why you here being the student as a non-Black woman should nonetheless take their concerns and their struggles seriously.
Yeah, Garrett, I love this question, and other people may be able to put in the chat some of their strategies, because I think some of this can be very dependent on your personality and your teaching style. And my teaching tends to be as transparent as my academic work. So I talk a lot about where I'm coming from, why I'm doing this, and this perspective. So for me, if I'm introducing something that is really outside of my experience and what I'm going to be able to speak to, I present that to the students. So I'll say, I've had this limited perspective. So we'll go through and I'll talk to them about the sources of privilege that I occupy. So I am white, I am cisgender, I am educated, I am middle class. So then, you know, I'll also talk to them about the ways in which that limits what I can know about the world and think about that world. And so then I introduce who we're going to turn to and how they help us to broaden that perspective and to think through those other. So that's always been my strategy, is just to be really upfront with them about why we're doing this. And again, I'd love to hear other people's approaches to that question.
Okay, we need to move on. Danielle, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Paper. Next up is Keith Abney's paper titled AI, Robots, Just War Theory and Policing, the Limits of an Analogy. Keith, welcome. Keith, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Maybe this is the limit of AI.
Indeed.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. I mean, you're straight.
There we go. I'm not entirely sure what happened. Don't trust robots and AI. I'm going to breeze through this because it's much, much longer potentially than I have time for. So and I want to get to questions. So just note questions as you go along, and then hopefully we'll have time to talk at the end. So abstract, there's been a lot of talk about the analogy between policing and war, especially in the light of the BLM movement, the George Floyd killing and all the rest, and the militarization of the police. Should we think about policing in the same way we think about soldiering? It's a problematic analogy at best. But in this paper, I propose to take the analogy seriously. Let's look at policing from the perspective of just war theory. And we're going to come to several conclusions about that. And then I'm going to then say, well, could robots and AI do a better job, right? Is that the future of policing? Just as it's been much discussed about it being the future of war fighting. So in traditional just war theory, we have some necessary conditions like proper authority and public declaration. A just war has to be waged by a competent authority, normally an internationally recognized state, for a publicly stated purpose. You don't get to have secret wars. And it has to be for a just cause, in self-defense against an unjust attack on an innocent citizen or state. Well, General Mark Hertling, in responding to the BLM movements and the way in which they were being policed, in particular in Portland, noted that the Homeland Security officers and the Border Patrol officers who did not wear their names on their uniforms in Portland because of their fear of being doxxed by protesters. Well, he pointed out senior leaders in Afghanistan are often targeted by terrorists, yet names are visible. And he has a picture of himself with his name in 2 different languages. So public declaration, right? Big deal in just war. Another of the traditional parts of just war theory are proportionality and last resort. The good achieved by a war, securing the just cause, must be proportional to the evil of waging it, right? You don't wage a massive war to remedy a small wrong. And it has to be a last resort, so that peaceful means of avoiding the war have already been exhausted. But of course, policing in this country didn't follow either one of those in terms of how the BLM protests were responded to. For example, in Minneapolis, a joint patrol of the police and the National Guard, again showing the militarization of the response, shot impact projectiles at people peacefully standing on their front porches. And before they did that, the security forces yelled, "Light them up." So not a last resort. Then there's a phenomenon known as kettling. Don't know if you folks are familiar with this. If you're not, the police basically take peaceful protesters and intentionally herd them into a confined area so that then there's no place for them to escape when the police attack. So on June 1st, Pennsylvania State Police and the Philadelphia Police, here's a quote from one of the people who was the victim of this kettling. "People started putting their hands up, but the cops wouldn't let up. We were drooling, coughing uncontrollably. The police were hitting and tackling people. They were dragging people down, forcing them on their knees, lining them up, kneeling on the median on the highway with their hands in zip ties, and yet still the police would pull down their masks and spray and gas them again." So it certainly seems to fail not only last resort, but right intention. You have to have the morally correct motivation when engaging in war. Another example of kettling. Two fundamental aspects of just war theory: jus in bello, or proportionality and discrimination. The military ends must be proportionate to the means. No unnecessary violence is to be used. In order to attain your military goal, only the minimal level of force needed. And discrimination, also sometimes called the principle of distinction, with the associated principle of non-combatant immunity. You have to attempt to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, and non-combatants must not be intentionally targeted or killed. So the policing response to the Black Lives Matter movement at various times violated every single one of these principles. It seems straightforward then, if we're going to take seriously the analogy between policing and the military, that the police repeatedly committed war crimes. Another principle, the benevolent quarantine for prisoners of war. If enemy soldiers surrender and become captives, they cease being lethal threats. They are no longer engaged in harm, so it is unjust to target them. And as I just explained in kettling, that's what's going on. As one author puts it, internal jus in bello essentially boils down to the necessity for a state to still respect the human rights of its citizens as best it can during a crisis. So again, if we take seriously this analogy, much of the response to the BLM movement consists of, well, war crimes. So now, could robots do better? Well, I've done work in this field, and so it seems clear for those who are thinking about what are called lethal autonomous weapons systems, killer robots, or the abbreviation is LAWS. Well, the goal then should be, hey, the robots need to be programmed to do all those things I just talked about, right? And so they should never intentionally target civilians, and they should have a tailored, minimal set of rules of engagement, how they're actually going to fight their battles, designed to minimize collateral damage. And a version of the doctrine of the double effect is the usual means for testing. Do you really have a tailored, minimal set of rules of engagement designed to minimize the collateral damage? So I won't bother going through that. If you have questions, okay. Now, there have been a lot of folks in this debate who have said, nonetheless, killer robots are not remotely morally permissible. One of the most notable is a fellow named Noel Sharkey, who founded a group called the CSKR, the Committee to Stop Killer Robots. And he says, well, there's several arguments why killer robots should be forbidden in war. First is the serious criterion, as they call it in international law. The serious injury or unnecessary suffering criterion. Does your way of fighting a war cause superfluous injury that's serious and superfluous, double S, you might say, or unnecessary suffering? If so, that's an illegitimate way of fighting a war. And discrimination. Is there meaningful human control of the way in which you're fighting a war against a target that is legitimate under international law? Sharkey's argument is simple. Robots, at least for now, fail both of these criteria. They will cause superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering. And if they are not under direct human control, they will be unable to distinguish between combatant and non-combatant, friend or foe, civilian or not. And Sharkey would say all of this applies doubly to police robots, so that trying to replace human police with, well, robots is going to make things worse, Sharkey thinks. Now, there's another approach to arguing that military robots are immoral. And that's to say that they're going to bring more violence as a result. They're going to end up not contributing to peace, but to strife. And the argument goes like this. If societies pay less, right, because of robots, to engage in forcible coercion, they would increase demand. It's simply economics. When you decrease the price of a good, you get greater demand for it. If the good is forcible coercion, forcing someone to do what I want, then making it cheaper to engage in forcible coercion will increase the demand for it. Well, why would using robots decrease the price of, well, forcible coercion? Well, first of all, because plausibly there'll be less bloodshed, right? First of all, no human soldiers or policemen or National Guard will die if you're using robots, right? Less bloodshed, at least on the authoritarian side, on the side of those using the robots. And quite possibly less bloodshed on the other side, because if you're facing a group of killer robots, you're likely to give up right away, right? So less negative public opinion, especially if body bags coming home or policemen engaging in obviously horrible acts makes the evening news. Well, if police robots simply with overwhelming force keep the peace, there's no terrible TV vignettes that I can show, no pictures like I just showed from Amnesty International. And frankly, there's less price in the purely economic sense as well. Robots are expensive, military robots and policing robots, presumably. But that cost is all up front. They don't require pensions. They don't require health care. They don't require any of the running costs that humans do over the long term. And so all the kind of cost benefit assessments has made clear that in the long run, robots are much cheaper than hiring humans to do the same job. So given the economics of the situation, it seems clear that, well, moving to killer robots, either in policing or in the military, will decrease the price, right, of forcible coercion. And if you decrease the price, that increases demand. Now, if more forcible coercion is mostly worse, because most of it is unjustified, then that will make for a worse world, is the argument. So it's not impossible in principle that robots could help things, but in practice, they're likely to make things worse, not better. There are other problems for using robots and AI in policing and the military. One problem is unclear responsibility. To whom should we assign blame or punishment? When robots go rogue, when they cause an unauthorized harm, should it be the designer of the robot, the programmer, the manufacturer, the procurement officer, the controller or supervisor, the field commander or the officer using it, the government leadership, or the robot itself? In the literature, this is called the responsibility gap problem. One possible solution to the responsibility gap problem, ensuring robots follow what's called a slave morality. Of course, that's a loaded term. In this sense, it simply means that a robot has to follow orders no matter what. It can only choose the means to follow the orders. It can never choose whether or not to follow the orders themselves. It can never say, I would prefer to do something else. All right. That's a solution to the responsibility gap problem in the sense that you then blame whoever gave the orders, right? The robots will simply be following their orders and choosing how to do so. So if they do something horrible, they were just following orders. And unlike with human defendants, as was talked about in the previous session, that seems to be a defense, right, for the robot, but not for the human giving the order. But of course, here's the problem. What if the humans giving the order are themselves unethical? What if they give an unethical order? Should a robot actually have the ability to refuse to follow an order, an unethical, illegal order? And of course, we know that folks in the military and in the police will sometimes issue unethical orders. There's even been movie depictions of this. In case you folks don't recognize this, this is the police chief in RoboCop. So, should we instead say slave morality, bad idea? If robots have better situational awareness, should they be able to refuse a legitimate or an illegitimate order, right? For example, we might have a nurse in Louisville alive right now if a robot could refuse the order to storm an apartment, right? So, in the general discussion about killer robots, there's this autonomy worry, which was at the heart of Sharkey's objection to using them. Killer robots mean a human, in some sense, doesn't have control of what the robot does. That's the whole point of saying robots have autonomy. So should we have humans in, on, or out of the loop? I'm going to end by saying that I think the future here depends on a key concept that has been not enough discussed. What we're really talking about are relative degrees of risk. We'll run certain risks by having robots complement and ultimately, at least in part, replace humans, both in warfighting and in policing. We'll also decrease some risks and increase others. It's entirely possible that robots will behave more morally than humans in many, many circumstances. the first part of my talk showed you, human policemen, human National Guard troops can do despicable things. It doesn't seem, when you focus on that, to be too hard to think that robots could do better, right? On the other hand, they could also do worse. So, how are we going to assess the risk? Is the risk of replacing humans with AI and robots worth it? Well, ultimately, this is a question of risk assessment and what makes an acceptable or unacceptable risk. And that certainly has at least all of the following elements. Is the risk to be borne voluntary, involuntary, or non-voluntary? Non-voluntary, you don't even know that you're running the risk. Involuntary, against your will. Voluntary, yes, I accept the risk. And of course, to say a risk is voluntary means you have at least some information about it. Is it enough to say, yeah, I can reasonably give informed consent to this risk? How serious is the magnitude of the possible harm, and how likely is it? And the ultimate question, both for political polarization and for our future, I think, is who gets to decide? In our society, who will get to determine what counts as an acceptable risk and what counts as an unacceptable risk? Already we have drone swarms, this came out literally yesterday, that are incapable of being controlled or defeated by a single human. Right now, already, there's an existing technology of very, very tiny robots that if they wanted to send them after you, there's nothing you could do. That risk already exists, and the technology's going to get better, which means the risk in some sense is going to get worse, right? How should we think about that in the future? Who gets to decide whether these kinds of risks are acceptable or unacceptable? Okay, folks, I'm going to stop the share then, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Thanks, Keith. Barry, I think you were up for the first question. Barry?
He's muted.
Barry?
Sorry.
There you go.
We talked about illegitimate objectives being given to robots, but what about robots being given legitimate objectives? Then there's perhaps an infinite number of means that they would be free to choose. How can we be assured that they would choose legitimate means? Because that's really the issue.
Well, that's certainly at least part of the issue. And so this is part of Sharkey's claim that at least for now, they're not possibly legitimate. Is that simply we can't, at this point in programming, guarantee that they observe the principles of distinction and resulting non-combatant immunity, right, well enough to hope to solve that. Now, some solutions, one solution that's popular amongst the pro robots crowd is to have what's called a kill box, right? You'll use the robots only in a specifically kind of delineated geographic area, such that everything that's within that is a legitimate target, right? Mm-hmm. And it simply won't go outside that area. Mm-hmm. And if in fact everything inside that box is a legitimate target, but of course, how do you guarantee that? Mm-hmm. And even in war, that's problematic. In policing, I can't even fathom how that would begin to be a solution. Sure. But notice this is a technical problem. At some point, they'll get better, right? Facial recognition, for example, if it got really good, might be able to say, we'll only target, right? Mm-hmm. The people who come up on our facial recognition, right? so that we can make it specific. Like I said, we could say it'll only attack Barry Gann and nobody else.
But
Right.
if you're talking about killer robots, then you're also talking about pretrial executions.
Potentially, sure.
Yeah.
Although, again, policing robots could say we will only detain Barry Gann as identified by.
I have less
Right.
problem with detention than murder. Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, thank you.
Pierce, you're up next.
Yeah, as you were talking about what you your kind of your whole paper. Sorry, I'm just kind of stumbling on my words. But you were having a very particular conception of the slave morality and how these robots kind of don't learn as they're operating, that they just constantly refer back to their first line of programming as their primary directive.
Well, let me stop you right there, Pierce, because I didn't say they don't learn.
Okay.
It's that they can't change their final goal to follow the order. They could learn in the process of trying to fulfill that final order, various better means, right? So that, for example, if I'm given the order, clear, right, this crowd of protesters, right? And so I start by sounding a bullhorn and that doesn't do it. So I learn that doesn't work and now I try a different means. So they absolutely would have presumably machine learning algorithms to learn how better to fulfill their goal. But what wouldn't change is I'm trying to fulfill that goal. To follow
So
that
what happens if, they sound the bullhorn, they find that doesn't work initially, they go on to start doing kind of the shield movement that we've seen as
Right.
a effective methodology to disperse crowds. The next time they do it, are they not going to sound the bullhorn? Are we going to clear their learning every single time?
It's going to depend on the details of the algorithm. Presumably on most machine learning, they would probably, the way it would essentially work is they would lower the priority ordering of the bullhorn. They wouldn't necessarily move it to 0 right away in terms of the weighting, but they would lower the weighting of that as the initial response. And this, in other words, we're going to get into the weeds of how machine learning algorithms work, but essentially they don't usually go from 100 to 0 in terms of the weighting. In other words, if it doesn't work, they decrease the weighting, but not to 0. And if it works, they increase the weighting, but not to 100%. Trial and error, you might say. Other questions?
Garrett's up next. Let me just mention this, that Court says he's going to have to shut down the room at noon to download the recording. So Garrett and Keith, if you can wrap up by noon, that would be great. Then Court said he would reopen the room once the downloading was finished.
Sure.
Thank you, Keith. Very interesting paper. Quick reference for you if you aren't familiar with it. Gordon Briggs and Matthias Schutz, both at Tufts University, have a paper called "Sorry, I Can't Do That." Okay, I see you're nodding, so I assume that means you're familiar with it. Yeah, but for those of you, the paper pertains to trying to teach robots to refuse orders. It's principally on the basis of doing it if it will hurt the robot. But obviously the same basic principles could potentially be used to refuse immoral orders if you could get the algorithm right. But that's the reference. My question to you, Keith, is to sort of to say, I'm curious if I'll put it this way. Do you share my perception that there is an incredibly difficult balance to strike in any such system, which on the one hand is going to have to try to be avoiding the kind of nightmare scenarios in which, in order to effectively police, the AI takes its own initiative and creates a police state in which all human beings are perfectly peaceful, perfectly law-abiding, and have no freedoms. So the extreme on one end there, which obviously is undesirable, and then an extreme on the other where anyone could subvert the police functions of a robot simply by ordering it to shut down and triggering a moral protocol in which it says, "Oh, maybe I'm doing something wrong, so I better shut off and not continue to hit this to pursue this police action." And it seems like, for whatever disadvantages that humans have, humans don't really seem to have that problem. I mean, potentially they could create the fascist dictatorship, of course, but that's the political problem. That's not the police function problem necessarily. So could an argument in favor of not using robots and instead stick with human beings just be that they're not going to hit either of these two extremes? They're going to land somewhere in the middle, even if they're not in an optimal place. So why gamble with the robots, which might and potentially could be more optimal, but also potentially could go to the extremes, which would be much worse either way?
Maybe. And yeah, and thanks for I mean, Matthias has written a whole bunch of stuff on this issue, and so he's one of the other, major figures in the field. I tend to think, I've been thinking about this for 2 decades now, and I tend to think that the ethical permissibility of robots is going to largely be a function of the ethics of the folks who are commanding the robots. Part of why I brought up the whole slave morality approach. I tend to think of the robots as a very sophisticated tool, right? Even though they're going to have some level of autonomy. And if there are good people using this tool to enhance their ability to fulfill legitimate aims, then they're going to be a good thing. And if there are bad people using this tool to enhance their ability to fulfill their aims, then that's going to be a really terrible thing. So if the typical person attending this conference got control of killer robots, I'd be pretty comfortable with that. If Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or, I don't know, Donald J. Trump got control of killer robots, I'd be much less confident that they're going to be a good thing. And unfortunately, given the way the world works, I know which of those groups of people are more likely to get control of killer robots. So, not sure if that entirely answers Garrett's question, but I think we might have time for one more. Now, Paul, okay.
I'm sorry, because
I know it's
we are just about at noon. So
Okay.
I think it's probably better to let Court go ahead and shut down the room, download the thing, and then he's going to reopen it. So you all can come back at that time and do your discussion.
Yeah, just sign back in.
Huh?
I said, just sign back in if you want to come here and hang out. It's lunchtime, so have fun.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll try to come back later, folks, if others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith, very much. We enjoyed it very much. Garrett, I had asked in the chat if you